Okay, on to new things. So here we see a little diagram that shows how all of the building blocks of religion that we talked about sort of come together to produce the institution that we call religion. A community with an institutionalized system of exchange with supernatural agents who are relevant to humans' existential concerns. So I guess the earliest form of something that would meet all of that, all of those criterion would be something like a Paleolithic tribe that eats a bunch of psychoactive mushrooms and goes deep into the cave and calls on the spirit of their great ancestor to help them in the hunt. I mean, that would be an institutionalized communal ritual calling on a supernatural agent to assist with an existential concern. And the theory is that something like that is the earliest form of religion, and that all other forms of religion are descended from that. Now, the religion that I just described, calling on an ancestor to help with the hunt while we've eaten mushrooms, is relatively primitive compared to something like the Roman Catholic Church. But that doesn't mean they aren't the same type of thing. Think about life on Earth, or organisms on Earth. The earliest form of life was a single-celled organism like a paramecium or a bacterium. And a bacterium is nothing like an endothermic vertebrate, but they're all a form of life. And the endothermic vertebrates evolved from those single-cell organisms. And so what we're saying is that these basic religions are the prototypical religions from which we get things like Roman Catholicism and Hinduism and the other great world religions. So we're talking about now not the building blocks of religion, but religion itself. Why do we have religion? It was either invented in several places simultaneously, or it was diffused all around the world. We have unambiguous evidence of religion as we've defined it by 10,000 BC at the earliest. And the interesting thing about religion is it's a pretty costly enterprise. It is resource intensive. We devote a lot of time to it. And the idea is like, why do we devote so much time to it? When you think about what we need to do to survival and what we need to do to improve our societies, wouldn't it be more profitable for people to improve their weapons and clothing rather than spend time painting on caves? On the left here you see Solomon's Temple that was constructed presumably constructed in about the 10th century BCE, and this was a massive undertaking. And wouldn't Israelite society have been better off if they had spent that time developing weapons technology or fortifying their cities or trying to work on their crops, and yet they shoveled virtually all of their surplus, including forced labor, into building this temple? What a costly undertaking. On the right, you see the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, also a massive undertaking that took decades to build. And the arid Great Basin, where the Mormon pioneers settled, is an incredibly inhospitable place. It has a short growing season. It's relatively dry. I mean, wouldn't they have been better off building more irrigation canals and spending more time on, taking care of the everyday needs of existence? So the idea is there has to be a reason why we expend so much time doing these things. And there are a couple schools of thoughts on this. The first is what we call the functionalist school. And the functionalist school says, yes, religion is costly, but the benefits exceed the cost. Religion exists because it promotes survival. It has essential functions. Otherwise, we would see atheist societies that would have proliferated. I mean, just in terms of natural selection, if you had societies that spent more time making weapons and advancing their food technology rather than doing all of this religious stuff, you would think that when it came time for battle or any kind of competition, that the religious people who spend so much time on their religion would be outcompeted by the atheist people, and that's not what you see. You see religion in almost all societies everywhere by about 10,000 BC. So it must really have been important, or it wouldn't have proliferated. Think about the time that religious people spend on church today that they could be spending on economic activity. A Mormon bishop is a volunteer. It's a man that has a job in the community and volunteers to be the head of the congregation. They can probably put in 20, 25 hours a week on their church work. Why would they do that rather than build their career or spend time with their family? So the functionalist school is religion must do something for human societies that is very, very important. Otherwise, why would it exist? How could the benefits exceed the costs? And so the reason that they argue that there aren't lots of secular societies around is because religion must do something functional for us. Another view is what we call the evolutionary byproduct view. And the idea here is that religion is a kind of mirage or illusion that fakes us out into spending time on it that we probably shouldn't spend time on. So earlier in the semester we showed optical illusions that hijack your visual cortex. And what scholars who advance the byproduct view say is that religion sort of hijacks society. Right? And you see these birds here on the video. This is the cuckoo, which is a bird that lays its eggs in the nest of other birds and then flies away. And what happens is when the cuckoo hatches, the bird whose nest it's in thinks that bird is its baby, and so it will feed it and nurture it. A lot of times the cuckoo is larger. You can see that cuckoo is larger than the songbird whose nest it's in, and it will push the other babies out. And so what happens is the cuckoos, the mother and dad cuckoo, don't have to invest any time in raising their offspring, because from an evolutionary standpoint, the songbird believes that whatever is in its nest is its baby, and it will go out and feed someone else's baby, another species' baby, and not even notice that its own children have been pushed out of the nest. And so in that way, natural selection has freed the cuckoo from caring for its young, and the songbird has to do it. And this is a classic case of parasitism. The cuckoo is a parasite that has hijacked the maternal instincts of the songbird. Or if you think about the bacterium Toxoplasmosis gondii, it is a pathogen that has to complete its life cycle in the body of a cat. And so what happens is that when toxoplasmosis gets into a rodent, it affects the rodent's brain such that it causes rodents to not only lose their instinctual fear of cats, but to go seeking cats, to be attracted to cats. So toxoplasmosis gets into the brain of a mouse, and then that mouse goes out and finds a cat to eat it. So the mouse is completely hijacked, and it does something that's bad for it. So the byproduct theorists say that there's an evolutionary tendency to believe in the supernatural, and we have sort of innate sociality, and these things combine to produce religion. And it is such a powerful evolutionary mix that it hijacks societies. For these people, atheist societies would be better off, but there aren't any of them because this sort of parasite of religion affects all societies. We would be better off if we expended that energy doing non-religious. The Mormons would have been better off if they hadn't built that temple. The Israelites would have been better off if they hadn't built that temple. But their societies were hijacked by religion in the same way that your visual cortex is hijacked by optical illusions. The philosopher Dan Dennett is the leading proponent of this view. And then there's a view called the conflict view, and we're going to talk a lot about this later on in the semester. And the conflict view is simply that religion is good for priests, and that you don't get the first priests until you get the first religions, and that religion is a way for priests or a priestly class to emerge and enrich itself. So, for instance, old people in society tend to take from society more than they contribute. Even in hunter-gatherer societies, the older you are, probably the worse hunter you are. And so the idea of ancestor worship is quite convenient for them. I mean, ancestor worship is very attractive for people who are about to become ancestors. And so this idea from the conflict school is that religion is a way for certain people to oppress other people. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we continue. For the rest of the semester, all of our discussion of religion will be set against a master narrative. And this master narrative is something called secularization. And a sort of one-sentence definition of secularization is that secularization is the declining scope of religious authority. And here is the definition that I have put on the video. Secularization is the transformation of a society from close identification with religious values and institutions toward non-religious values and secular institutions. The secularization thesis refers to the belief that as societies progress, particularly through modernization and rationalization, religion loses its authority in all aspects of social life and governance. And the reason why we use secularization as sort of the master narrative is first because it's evident. We'll see it in all aspects of a human society and religion. But it's also the case that this is literally the master narrative of sociology, that you really can't disentangle the logic of secularization and sort of the development of the corpus of sociological theory, because the two are completely intertwined. The guy who gave sociology its name, Auguste Comte, argued that there was a persistent trend of religious knowledge and behavior receding in favor of rational knowledge and behavior. Comte argued that primitive societies were in a theological stage where they were held in thrall by the gods and by magic and religion, and that as people's knowledge and intellect progressed and as their technology increased, they began to supplant religion with things like science and reason and rationality, and that the world is moving towards a more rational, demystified, less religious state. And this was not just Comte's idea. You see this evolutionary trend in most of the founders of sociology, and it's something still that sociologists tend to believe generally. I have a quote here on this slide from Anthony F.C. Wallace, a famous anthropologist, who argues the evolutionary future of religion is extinction. Belief in supernatural beings and supernatural forces that affect nature without obeying nature's laws will erode and become only an interesting historical memory. Belief in supernatural powers is doomed to die out all over the world as the result of the increasing adequacy and diffusion of scientific knowledge. Now, I think Wallace takes it way too far. He's sort of a radical secularization theory. But I think that there are lots of sociologists who argue that the end point of secularization is a sort of widespread indifference to religion, and the idea that there's no socially shared significant religion, or just that there's a general trend. And some people will say it could conceivably be reversed, but as it is now, there's a general trend from more religious to less religious. Here are some of the sources that I've used if you want to check into them on how secularization functions. And secularization is a fractal phenomenon that can be viewed. If you look, you can see that I have sort of the world history scale, the Western civilization scale, and the American society scale. And the sort of end of each stage is the beginning of the next stage, if you can sort of see how the the diagram works. So the idea is that whatever chunk of time you look at, you will see a general evolutionary trend toward secularization. So on the world history scale, looking at all of humanity, hunting and gathering societies were enthralled by religion, and they had daily needs from the gods. Imagine if you're getting up every morning to go hunting. It's dangerous, and it's based on luck. And so every day, we need to importune the gods to help us acquire the game that we need to meet our protein needs. Imagine sleeping under a lean-to. Think how dangerous it would be if we encounter lions. Think how exposed we are to the weather. We would constantly be asking the supernatural beings to protect us because so much is left up to chance. Now think about how things changed with the development of agriculture. You don't need everyday luck with respect to weeding and pruning the crops. You might say general prayers to help the crops come up. You might say general prayers to bring the rain, but the everyday tending of the garden or the everyday tending of domesticated animals is completely different from hunting and gathering in terms of the level of stress that it puts on the mind. It's because it's mundane and it's routine. It's not the kind of thing that you need to importune the gods about. You know, weeding the garden is going to be the same day in and day out. Slopping the hogs or feeding the sheep is going to be the same day in and day out. When you have permanent dwellings with a roof and a crossbeam locking the door, you worry less about lions. You worry less about the weather. And so the idea is that on the world history scale, as society moves from hunting and gathering to other economic forms, appeals to the supernatural take up less time, both in the minds of individuals and in the activities of societies. On the Western civilization scale, if you think about where we trace our intellectual history to Western Europe, you see a beginning of the separation of church and state. And in medieval Europe, church and state were intertwined. There was no separation of church and state. And then you start to see church and state separate, and you have the government separate from the denomination. And the denomination is a form of religion that exists separate from the state and must exist with other denominations. So you have sort of religious pluralism. In the end stage of Western civilization, you see the idea of switching religions, that I can switch from one religion to another. In medieval Europe, there was no way that you could switch religion. There was no, so changing your religion throughout most of human history would be as bizarre as saying you're going to change your ethnicity or you're going to change your race. Religion wasn't something that you could change back and forth because religion was rooted in all other things, where you lived, your kinship, your language. But now think about the idea that I can be religion A and I can shift to religion B. We see the decline of kings supported by divine right in favor of elected officials. We see constitutions that are based on philosophy and reason and political theory rather than laws that are based on religious texts. And so you start to see Europe secularizing. And so if you look at American society as a part of this Western culture, what you see is that American society has substantially secularized. Think about the fruits of the First Amendment. In the First Amendment to the Constitution, it guarantees that religion is not embedded in any government structure. So there is no idea of a state church. There's no government support, sponsorship of any church. And so if I want people to join my church, or if a particular denomination wants adherents, they have to market literally to people to see if you can get them to join. I mean, that's why you have Mormon missionaries and Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your door to get you to join, because churches can only get the allegiance of people who will give willful assent to submit to them. That's completely different from a society where religion is embedded in other kinds of social structures. You have not just conversion in American society now, but you have things that would have been considered preposterous or radical in medieval Europe, things like mixed faith marriages, a husband and a wife that are two different faiths, or a brother and a sister that are two different faiths. That would be absurd in centuries past. In the United States today, you see that there are no religious justifications in the civil law. You had all kinds of people in the marriage equality debate using the Bible to say that gay people shouldn't be able to get married, but when it was argued in front of the court, people who opposed marriage equality didn't quote the Bible. They had to make legal arguments because there can be no religious text that undergirds the civil law in the United States. You see the disentangling of crime and sin, where, you know, in a century ago, there was really no distinction between what was a crime and what was a sin. And now we think about things that are sins that aren't crimes, and things that are crimes that aren't sins. There are no more laws against blasphemy. There are no more laws against adultery. Moreover, because of the technology that we have, we don't see natural events as acts of God. Right? Generally, you know, the hurricane's going to hit somewhere, and you just can't. And so many of them come, and you are aware of your society on sort of a national scale, that it's just not useful to sort of wonder why this place got hit or that place got hit, because you can see sort of the capriciousness and randomness of hurricanes. So this is how secularization works at the American society scale. Or you can think about it in terms of like levels of analysis, right? So like secularization at the level of the individual would mean that in an individual brain, religion is compartmentalized, right? In your brain, you have things that are explained by science and things that are explained by religion. And at the level of the individual now, religion is rather less important to people than it was 100 years ago. Religion, secularization at the level of the institution is where various social institutions lose their connection to religion or lose their religious character. Southern Methodist University in Dallas is a completely secular university. It just happens to be called Southern Methodist University, and its affiliation with the church is mostly historical. And you know, Methodist doctrine is not taught, and you don't have to be a Methodist, and the faculty are not mostly Methodist. The Southern Methodist University is essentially secularized. Or institutions like holidays. Think of the etymology of the word holiday. It comes from holy day. And the idea of a secular holiday, like the 4th of July, is an oxymoron. Literally, a secular holiday is a secular holy day. But things like the 4th of July or things like St. Patrick's Day, these are holidays that are detached from religion. And you can see that people complain a lot, traditionalists complain a lot about the degree to which Easter and Christmas have begun to shed their religious character and have begun to look more secular. At the level of the community, the notion of religious pluralism means that community and religious norms disengage. When I was a kid, I lived in a Mormon enclave where virtually everybody was a Mormon, and nobody would go out and do yard work or mow the grass on Sunday, because Sunday was the Mormon Sabbath, and you're forbidden to do work on the Sabbath, and so you couldn't mow your lawn. And you wouldn't want to do that because you wouldn't want your neighbors to see you, because it would be, you might be inclined to mow your lawn, but you wouldn't do it because of the threat of social sanction. Well, when everybody in the neighborhood is a different religion, you can't sanction somebody for mowing the lawn on Sunday because community and religious norms are disengaged. And then secularization at the level of society government has detached from religion. So this is how we're going to look at things in terms of secularization, in terms of the movement from imbued with religion to detached from religion. And what sociologists say, what many sociologists say, is that there is sort of a direction, and the direction moves from more religious to less religious. And here's how I would explain it. Right? Think of some aspect of existence for which we once had a firmly established religious explanation, where that explanation was abandoned in favor of a scientific or naturalistic explanation. So like, in times past, in Western civilization, we saw some mental illness as a manifestation of demonic possession. Well, now we don't think that anymore because we have science and we understand a little bit more about brains and how mental illness works. So you can think of all kinds of things that were once explained by religion that are now explained by science. But can you think of something for which we once had a firmly established scientific explanation that was abandoned in favor of a religious explanation? A lot more difficult. And the reason why it's more difficult is because the causal arrow is moving essentially one way. So in subsequent weeks, we're going to talk about various functions of religion, things that religion does in society. And the master narrative is going to be how these things have become more secularized over time at the world history scale, at the Western civilization scale, and at the American society scale.